These are the notes for Chapter 33 for APUS History, the Great Depression and the New Deal. We'll be going through a screencast rather than just a podcast, so that way you can watch at home over spring break. And we are caught up by the time we get back and we can start Chapter 34, so make sure you've read that before April 1st, because we highly probably, will have a homework quiz when we get back. We mentioned in class a couple things for all of my classes, but I'm just going to go through them real quick. And then we'll get into the stuff that we haven't talked about yet, pick up with actually the New Deal, because we've talked about FDR and Eleanor. I'll probably do about 20 minutes of video and then stop and then make a second video for the next 20 minutes, just so that way you don't have to watch the whole video at once. Do it as you need to be caught up by April 1st. So here we go. Remember, you can stop and pause the video at any time. Makes it easier than class if you miss something. You can rewind it, etc. Alright, so in 1932, Hoover is the joke of the country. Remember, we talked about how a guy hitchhikes across the country with a sign during 1932 that says, "If you don't give me a ride, I will vote for Hoover." He makes it all the way across the country. And so FDR wins the election of 1932 by a landslide. The blue on the map is all FDR, the red is Hoover, so Hoover does get a couple states. He does get some electoral votes. And surprisingly, Hoover actually gets some popular votes as well. He's going to get about 40% because of those voters that just vote party lines rather than choosing based on candidate or issues. And so when Hoover leaves, he leaves FDR with a bunch of issues, as you can see in the political cartoon. This time period has lots of political cartoons, and they're fantastic, and I really enjoy them, so we'll be seeing a lot of them throughout the unit. Now, we talked a little bit about FDR, our new president, and his wife. What you need to know is that they are a collaborative team, that they end up not really having so much of a romantic relationship in office, but Eleanor becomes the eyes and ears of Franklin as he is unable to travel around the country because he is immobilized or paralyzed from the waist down and can't walk. However, he does create this image of mobility, and we talked about it in class, how he wears the leg braces, and so he would have to walk really slow, but he makes it look like he's doing that on purpose to greet everybody. And having polio when he was 39, even though he grew up really wealthy and privileged, having polio and having to deal with that and the pain for the rest of his life really meant that he was able to look at people and say, "I feel your pain," and mean it, as opposed to the other billionaires who would say that and didn't really have any suffering in their life to understand that. So he's a little bit different from other presidents, and that's going to be instrumental during this time period as he becomes a political force. Now, a bunch of you asked about FDR and Eleanor and how they are related. They are fifth cousins once removed. Eleanor is the niece of Teddy Roosevelt. Theodore really looked up to Cousin Teddy. And so I found a family tree for you. So you can see that it's really far. I mean, think of how many of you actually know your fifth cousins today. Not many. It's not common. They didn't grow up together. So it's not any awkward kind of thing. They met in the college age years and ended up getting married. So it's not a big deal. So when Roosevelt comes into office, he comes in promising a new deal for the American people. And this is like the phrase that he uses, the New Deal for the American people. And under the New Deal, he sets up his idea of his goal of the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. And you need to know these 3 and what they encompass. We'll talk about each of the acronyms in one of the other screencasts, so don't worry about those now. But know that relief means direct relief. We're helping those who are struggling now, who are starving, getting them food, giving direct support to the people who are in trouble. The second step is recovery, where you give people jobs, you help them recover their livelihoods, you get them back to work, you rebuild businesses, you get people back into their homes by stopping foreclosures, all of those things recovering from the problem. And the last part is reform, reforming the financial and business system so that way it can never happen again. We never have another Great Depression. This is the goal of Roosevelt. So when he comes into office, during the transition time, he's elected in November, and he'll be inaugurated in March, and he'll actually be the last president to be inaugurated in March. Those 5 months are a very long time for the American people to wait, because Hoover's not really doing a whole lot. And FDR doesn't want to give Hoover the power to do anything in his name. And so as soon as Roosevelt gets into office, he's going to push through the 20th Amendment, which is called the lame duck amendment usually, and it just basically says that the president's term of office now begins on January 20th rather than March 20th. So it's about 2.5 months rather than 5 months. for the term of office to begin. And during this transition, between November and March, he's meeting with intellectuals and academics and professors, the best in the field, and these guys are called the Brain Trust. And he's going to tell them all of the problems. Here are the problems of America that we need to solve. What are your ideas? What are your solutions? And he actually listens to them and consults with them and takes their counsel. And so they're going to be a really big deal in forming his mindset about how to provide relief, recovery, and reform during his first administration and second administration. And so what ends up happening is after he's inaugurated, he doesn't really have a lot of time to work with them, but some of them actually become part of his cabinet, and he's going to set this precedent like George Washington had done, that you surround yourself with the best and the brightest. You don't necessarily want to surround yourself with everybody that agrees with you. You want to surround yourself, similar to Lincoln as well, with people who may disagree, so that way you can get the best ideas from the arguments that happen in cabinet meetings. Now, surprisingly, he puts this cabinet together, and for the first time ever, the best and the brightest in one of the fields, especially labor, is a woman named Frances Perkins. I'll spell her name here for you. She's going to become his Secretary of Labor, and that's going to be really instrumental. She is the first woman to hold a cabinet-level position. So FDR takes office, and he takes Washington by storm, and he's going to call Congress in to a special session for 100 days, and this is called the 100 Days Congress. And they're going to set a precedent for what presidents are supposed to do when they get into office, because previously, presidents will get in, they say, yeah, I have this idea, but we'll deal with that later. I have this idea, we'll deal with that later. And now Roosevelt is saying, no, when you get into office, you have your ideas and you push them into place immediately. So that's a new precedent that becomes very significant. He's not going to wait around to try and solve the problems of the Great Depression. He's going to go now. So Congress is fully on his side. All of the Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and they are willing to give FDR anything he wants. He kind of becomes seen as the savior in the Democratic Party. So the Supreme Court is still conservative at this point. It will be a much later fight. They were all put into as justices from all of our Republican presidents during the 1920s and late 1800s. So FDR is going to do what we call alphabet soup, and pushing through Congress a bunch of legislation in that 100 days that creates the alphabet soup. So these are the programs that change the way government works. Okay, and we'll talk about each one of them individually, so you don't need to know them specifically now. But we have the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the National Recovery Administration, the Works Progress Administration, and the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. So he creates these programs, and we'll talk about each of them, but it's interesting because in the political cartoon, what do you notice about Roosevelt? He's standing up. He couldn't actually stand fully by himself very easily because of his leg braces and his legs, but yet all of the political cartoons show the president running or standing or doing something the president would not have been able to do. Okay, so they always show him as active, which is very interesting. Now, when he first takes office, the entire banking system is teetering on collapse, on the verge of collapse, or already collapsed. And so when he gets into the office, he immediately calls what we call a bank holiday. And this is when he closes the banks for 4 days, and he's going to spend time reorganizing the banks. They actually post policemen outside of a lot of banks, so that way people don't have another run on the banks. And so when, he closes all of the banks, he's going to get the bankers together with politicians. He locks them in a room until they can reestablish the banks stably and solve the problem. Because all of these banks have been closing over the last few years, especially after the crash, when they're closing in the thousands, okay? And people are losing their money when the banks close, and it makes the Depression a whole lot worse. So FDR does this and tries to solve the problem. So this was a key part to stemming the Great Depression. He gives the politicians and the bankers 3 days to work out a solution. They write a bill. They send the bill to Congress. And the bill is not even printed. Nobody had read it. They used a proxy, which means like another sheet of paper with nothing written on it, to stand in for it. And they passed the bill reforming the banking industry with never having read it, which is incredible. They had just been told what it encompassed by Roosevelt and the politicians and bankers who had been locked in that room writing it. Can you imagine that happening today? Never would have happened today. Oh wait, they just passed a budget that was about 1,000 pages long that probably nobody read. Congressmen don't always read the bills today, their staffers usually do, and then inform the congressman of the key points in the bills these days. So FDR is going to retwist how the banks are created. So then he's going to reopen the banks after the law is passed, but not before he gives his first fireside chat. And we're going to skip the whole prohibition part for one sec. We'll come back to that in a minute and talk about fireside chats. But again, in a lovely political cartoon, you can see how the 100 days it looks like Roosevelt is dragging everybody along, again, an active political cartoon, and pushing everybody through to get this emergency legislation passed. So his fireside chats, he has 27 total. He is using the radio to address the general public, and people listen like we watch the Super Bowl today. Actually, more people would listen to him talk on the radio than Americans watch the Super Bowl today, which is pretty incredible. Think of how many people actually watch the State of the Union today. And so what happens? He's using radio to communicate with the people. He's going over Congress's head. He's going over the newspaper's head. He's taking these problems directly to the American people. There is a link on Blackboard that will be posted in a minute that basically has audio recordings of all of his fireside chats. And if you have a minute, it's really beneficial to go and hear Roosevelt actually speaking, because it's really incredible how he was very charismatic, and it made it sound like he was sitting there in the room with you and talking to you. And he basically says in his first fireside chat that it is safe to put your money back in the bank. So when the banks reopen, he encourages people to put their money back in the banks. Don't stuff it under the mattress. That's not as safe. Okay? And everyone's wondering whether this works or whether the banks are going to collapse. And it turns out it works. So the emergency legislation works, reforming the banking industry. And people start putting their money back in the banks, which also helps save the banks. And this saves the entire banking system. And so with his first fireside chat, Roosevelt is going to set a precedent for how to fix things by going directly to the people over the head of Congress. And so this is the first of many, and this is how he is working on fixing things. Now, going back up in your packet, we need to change that for next year. He is also going to repeal prohibition. So the 21st Amendment pushed through Congress to the Constitution repeals the 18th Amendment. It's done in December of 1933, and prohibition is done. And so you can see how in a newspaper, prohibition ends at last, and a guy sitting on the street says the good old days are back again. And so basically everyone says, we've had a really hard time the past couple of years with the Great Depression. I think we should sit down and use a drink. And America basically says okay to this proposal by FDR. Now, FDR is funny. He's famous for having the Children's Hour, which is a cocktail hour at the White House at 6 p.m. every night where people would gather. And you were forbidden from talking about politics. You had to talk about gossip and what was going on in people's lives. And FDR would mix drinks for everyone, and he was a terrible bartender. So Churchill would get a drink from FDR, and Churchill would actually find it so disgusting that he would pour it on the plants in the White House. So FDR didn't drink that much, but he loved sitting around with people talking about gossip and hearing all the latest stories. And so getting people a drink or two in Washington usually helps promote the gossip to happen. So everybody was pretty happy with the repeal of Prohibition, and obviously Prohibition, our noble experiment, didn't end up working out so well. So that's the 21st Amendment. Now, you can see how FDR has a lot of plans and a lot of New Deal remedies. Another political cartoon that I really enjoyed kind of shows he's leading it. It's not Congress leading anymore. He's the one leading the whole chain of events. Now, in terms of recovery, okay, so we saw a Banking Relief Act. In terms of recovery, it was also a Reform Act. They're going to set up work to set up faith in the banking system. And so we were talking about the Emergency Banking Relief Act, which they were passed in Congress without reading. This reorganizes the banks. They figure out which ones can stay in business, which ones need to be closed. And so the government is actually going to go through the books of the banks and say, listen, you're not exactly financially sound. You can't pay off your debts. You need to close shop. And so they would close that bank. And then they would go to another bank and look through the books and say, your bank is doing pretty well. You can pay back your debts. You did not do enough of that crazy loan cycle that put everybody in debt. We'll let you stay open. So this is what they're doing. They also create the FDIC, which is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insures your deposits of up to $5,000 in 1932 for the bank. in that time's money. So FDR says that you should invest, you should put your money back in the bank, and if the bank does go under, the federal government will pay you back up to $5,000 for each account you have. And so it puts the American government power and prestige behind the banking industry. The U.S. government is backing up everything you have in a bank. And this makes people much happier to invest in the banks, knowing that A, the banking industry is backed up by the federal government, and B, if the bank does fail like they had before, their money is going to be given back to them. Okay, now don't worry about how the federal government's going to pay. They're going to make sure that the banks don't close. They don't have to, but that's the idea. Now, $5,000 was about $50,000 worth of today's money, so that was a lot back then. Today, the limit, it went up to $100,000 for a couple years, many years actually. And then with the banking crisis in 2008, Congress upped the amount the FDIC insures up to $250,000 per bank account, I believe. So if you have $250,000 in a bank, then you'll get that amount back. If the bank closes unexpectedly, if you have less than that, you'll get that same amount back. If you've got $5 million in the bank, then you're only going to get $250,000 back from it. But most people don't have that much money in the bank, so it doesn't really matter that much. The third thing they do for financial recovery is set up the Homeowners Loan Corporation. This helps refinance mortgages at a lower rate to help people stay in their homes, so you'd have less of a percentage to pay every single month on your mortgage, and it helps people stay in their homes and not lose them. So that's a really good thing. And then he also sets up the Farm Credit Administration, which helps give loans to farmers at a very low rate to save their farms so that they don't get foreclosed upon. And so they're trying not to crush the farmers anymore, trying to save them from the economy. And you can see how our political cartoon here is not exactly pro for it, from a nice newspaper that was not happy with this. So that's what he's doing financially. Now, for the unemployed, he's going to do a couple different programs. Okay, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration is going to be created to give direct aid to people. So this is, if you're making a chart of relief, recovery, reform, this is a relief. It's going to provide money to the states for soup kitchens and things like that. He's also going to create the Public Works Administration, which is going to give money to states to build infrastructure, bridges, roads, dams, schools, post offices, courthouses, things like that. And the idea is that you put people to work by building things that will last a long time, like a building or like a road. Okay, so in Virginia, the CCC, or the PWA, went and helped build a lot of schools, a lot of older schools. They built, I know for example, the post office in Arlington was built during this time period. The CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, and the Public Works Administration are together going to help build the Blue Ridge Parkway that goes through the mountains. And so they're doing a lot of good by providing jobs for people. It's not giving handouts, it's recovery, it's providing jobs. The most popular program created is the Civilian Conservation Corps. It's employing young men under the age of 25, normally from inner cities, normally not married, they don't have kids, and they move them, they transplant them. So they go out west, they plant trees, they build roads, and there are two purposes for this, for the demographic that they choose. The first is that if you're taking the younger guys and sending them out west to go clear out a forest in, Colorado or somewhere, then you're opening up jobs in the cities for the men who have families and kids to provide for. So that helps. Second, by moving them out west, they're going to keep them in a military-type barrack. They're going to have a routine, and it's actually a very popular program, and about 2/3 of the money they make each month or each week is going to be sent back home to their moms and dads to help support their families as well. So the CCC is going to be challenged all the way up to the Supreme Court. We'll talk about that later. Another thing that FDR works on, is going to be the Tennessee Valley Authority. Roosevelt is going to go to the Tennessee Valley where they're trying to change the land. They've had a lot of droughts, they've had a lot of floods from the Tennessee River, and things are not going so well. So they're going to begin by building one dam in the Tennessee Valley and creating hydroelectric power, which is going to compete directly with the private electric companies, which is going to be challenged by big business. But it's also going to provide electricity for a lot of the rural areas in Tennessee that had never had electricity. After one dam, they go on and they build a series of dams along the Tennessee River and the other rivers in that area. And so they're providing a lot of electricity and also helping the dams help stabilize the flow of the river and prevent flooding and things like that. Now, the government is going to own the Tennessee Valley Authority as an agency, and it's going to compete directly with private electric companies. And so this is going to be challenged by big business because you have the government interfering in private industry, and they don't really like that. But Roosevelt goes along with the idea anyways and kind of doesn't listen to the businesses on this one. They also create the Industrial Recovery Program, also known as the National Recovery Administration, or the NRA, and this is the centerpiece of Roosevelt's New Deal. They call it the Blue Eagle because that's kind of the symbol of it. You can see in the poster here. And the idea of the NRA is to control and manage the entire industrial process. So it's going to set up minimum wages. It's going to set up fair working conditions, fair labor practices. It's going to encourage workers to unionize. It's going to force big business to abide by regulations. Do not undercut each other, trying to destroy the competition. So instead of having a Wild West free market like we had before, Roosevelt wants a managed economy. He's looking at the situation that created the Great Depression, the overproduction of goods, the speculation, all of that kind of stuff. And he's saying, no more. We're done. That caused the Great Depression. We need to control it so that we can't have that happen again. Now, it's going to be challenged and taken to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, the conservative Supreme Court, is going to rule it as unconstitutional. And that's going to make FDR very angry at the Supreme Court, which will lead into something a little bit later. Lastly, for unemployed, he creates the Farm Production Control Program, which is known as the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Now, farmers had long been overproducing crops. There was no demand for it, and the prices had dropped, like we saw as one of our causes of the Great Depression. And so what the Agricultural Adjustment Act is going to do is try to stabilize farm prices much more so than Hoover had tried to do. And they're trying to get the farmers not to grow so much food. So they do that by paying the farmers what we call subsidies, or a certain amount of money, to stop growing food on acres of land that the government doesn't want them to plant on. So instead of growing 12 acres of land worth of corn, grow 6 this year. And we'll pay you money for every acre you don't grow food on. That way, we won't have as much corn produced and the prices will rise. They'll also be paid to, like on cattle ranches, to slaughter the animals and just dump it, not take the meat to market. That's also controlling the amount of meat on the market so the prices rise. And it's an ironic idea because during this time period, you have people starving from being unable to purchase food and find a job, and yet we're paying farmers to destroy food. Okay, so this is also going to be seen as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, which is going to be very interesting. And that takes us through our first part of the New Deal. We'll stop the video there. We'll start a new video for the second part of the New Deal.